So this morning, I'm going to give you my thoughts on the student-teacher relationship. And as I've been thinking about this and preparing this talk, I realized it's such a huge subject that I can only take one small bite out of it today. So we'll do our best to try to get our heads around this because it's a very large subject. And I have to go back to Lisa's question a couple of weeks ago about what do philosophy and psychology have to do with Zazen? And at the time I said, well, nothing to do with Zazen because Zazen is beyond language. But in this case, in the student-teacher relationship, we run into a lot of psychology just because this is the kind of culture that we have, and it's the way that we're accustomed to framing the things that happen to us. So today we'll have psychological terms because this is something that we have, it's a tool that we're using to understand how we relate to one another. And I'm also going to give a disclaimer at the very beginning of this, that this is my practice experience. I'm speaking from my own experience, and it is mostly the experience of a monastic and not a lay person. So your mileage may vary. So from my perspective, in relationship and Zen practice, we have two places that we are working from. One is the world of formlessness and no language, and the other is the human experience realm of form. So we have, in this way, a relationship between a teacher and a student is very intimate in this way. It's like the Tai Chi symbol that I mentioned in my little blurb about the talk for the newsletter, in that there is a circle, a big circle that contains two entities, and there's this little curved line along which they meet. They don't intersect and they don't merge, but they touch in the center of this circle. And there's one side of it is black and the other side of it is white, a little teardrop of black and an upside down teardrop of white. But within the black, there's a little dot of white. And within the white, there's a little dot of black. That's like Sekido Kisen says in Merging of Difference and Unity. Right in light, there's darkness, but don't confront it as darkness. Right in darkness, there is light, but don't see it as light. So these two things are together, yet separate, and each contains the seed of the other. So this is the symbol that I think best reflects the student-teacher relationship, in that we are very intimate with each other, and yet we are separate and yet together within the big circle of the whole. So we're always working with that duality of together, not two and not one, this old Zen saying, and yet within the unity as well. So the unity and duality. It's good old paradoxical Zen. And I also want to say at the beginning that we have to recognize that every person is our teacher, and each one of us is also a student. So we have those two roles that we play throughout our experience of Zen practice. I've gone back and forth about which aspect to talk about first. I'll just go down. I'll follow the paper. So forming the relationship, a teacher in a tradition who has received transmission from someone, given permission to transmit the Dharma, is a person who has a big view of everything. But it does come down to each individual that comes in the door as well. The teacher cares for each person who comes in the door of the Zen Center. I found this was quite an interesting experience after I became a teacher with my own Zendo. It didn't matter what that person was like. Somehow within me arose a distinct love for that person, a caring. I cared what happened to them, regardless of how they behaved or who they became. It just arose within me. And I didn't do anything to cultivate that particularly, but it seemed to be a function of the teaching role. So I stepped outside of my whatever personal feelings I might have had about that person, and became their spiritual friend. And that's what a teacher is for us. A teacher is our spiritual friend. They care about our spiritual condition, and they listen to us as we describe our spiritual condition, and they steer us. From my perspective, it's never the right thing to do to tell someone how to solve their problems. Our job as a teacher is to help the student find that within themselves. So each person can find the answer to whatever is next right here. It's to help people learn how to trust that inner intuition, that inner voice that comes when we're sitting on the cushion and helps us to guide our lives. So regardless of whether or not you become a Buddhist formally, the teacher cares for you personally, just because you're here within the Zendo. And that is the teacher's job, is to care for each individual that comes to practice. Now, this relationship can be formalized by taking the precepts from the teacher and entering the lineage of the temple where you are practicing. And this relationship is a little more intensive. So you sew a rakusu, the little robe that Mickey here and Karen are wearing. You sew the little robe and you receive the precepts from the teacher. And the precepts are transmitted to you. And I will talk later about transmission, because that's a very important piece of this relationship. So this is a lifelong reciprocal relationship that we enter into when we soa rakusu and take the precepts. It can be broken. We can decide at some point that we want to go to a different teacher, and in which case we would have the respect to go to our present teacher and ask them if we can leave and go to this other teacher. It's a formality, but it's really important to do that because it shows respect to the teacher for all the care that they have given you thus far. So it's a very intimate and sort of familial relationship. But there are lots of different reasons why people would leave a teacher and go to somewhere else. And I've had many teachers, but then I was sent by my teacher to other teachers. So there's also that too. If you feel like you want to go and train with another teacher for a while, you can have your teacher send you to that other teacher. And that does not, you still retain your relationship with your root teacher, who is the first teacher who gave you the precepts. So this is kind of detailed and complicated and formal, but that's the way it works within the Zen world. And it's always good to know that because the Zen world is small. And if you're going from temple to temple, you want to go with your teacher's blessing because it helps at the other end. Now, you can receive the precepts multiple times from multiple teachers as well. In just our temple here, you would have your jukai, which is the receiving of the lay precepts. If you got ordained as a monk, you would take the precepts again in a little bit longer form. And if you were transmitted as a teacher, you take the precepts again. So we take the precepts over and over. And in the case of the people who went to the 100th anniversary of the Soto Zen that was celebrated in Los Angeles, they were given the precepts there and they received lineage papers. So they also were transmitted the precepts in that case. So within this relationship, within this one-to-one relationship now, we're not talking about the larger relationship of the Sangha. Within this one-to-one relationship, what does the teacher owe to the student? Well, I mentioned that the teacher is a spiritual friend, and it's really, the teacher owes the student unswerving support for the student's personal growth in their spiritual life. Shasta Abbey's Jikyo Kennett had a great enlightenment experience that lasted for a very long time, weeks at least, possibly months. And she actually wrote a book about her great enlightenment experience called How to Grow a Lotus Blossom. And one of her visions during that time was of this waveless lake that was full of lotus blossoms. And as she looked further, there were heavenly beings along the shores of this lake. And the roots of the lotuses were in the world of form, but the lotuses themselves were somewhere else. She designated it heaven. And when these lotus blossoms opened up, there were monks inside and people inside there. And they were, and the beings that were around the lake were engaged in taking care of these lotus blossoms. So I always like to think of each person who comes to the Sangha as a lotus blossom. They might be all closed up, just not even way underwater, like lotuses are when they first start growing. And they have a long way to go before they come to the surface and open up. But then there are others who come who have one or two leaves open. And there are some people that walk in the door and, by God, they're a full-grown lotus, But nevertheless, I think it's the teacher's job to nurture each person as if they were a little Buddha within a lotus blossom. It's just such a loving image that I really enjoy that. A teacher provides support for each student in their life challenges where, there might be a divorce, or the student might get ill, or there might be a death in the family, or the student might actually die. And it is part of the teacher's work to support students in these emergencies during their lives. I think the teacher needs to do their own psychological work outside the Zendo to avoid projecting personal issues onto the student, because this is so much like a family relationship. If you're practicing together all the time, especially if you're living together in the Zen house, these kinds of issues will arise. And you bring all of your family of origin stuff with you when you come to the Zendo. So it's part of practice to work with those things together. But you don't want to bring your own personal issues that might be caused by something that happened in your family life that you're still working with at the age of 64, and project it onto the students in your care. Another thing that a teacher should be doing is presenting the Dharma in all aspects of their life, including regular Dharma talks, study, and programming that trains the student in all aspects of Zen practice. And then the teacher serves as an example of practice for the Sangha. That's a very difficult role, because inevitably you are a human being and you're going to mess up. And then you have an audience for all of your mistakes. So that's always something that is difficult to work with sometimes, because you've made a mistake. Everybody else knows you've made a mistake. And we all have to be non-judgmental with each other in that case, because teachers are human beings and they lose their tempers sometimes. So I say the teacher serves as an example of practice for the Sangha. It may be positive and it may be negative. And we as students have to take that on. So what, as students, do we owe to the teacher in this reciprocal relationship? Well, we owe them a lot of respect and gratitude for the gift of their life, for their years of training, for their care of us, and the gift of the Dharma. These things are utterly precious. They cannot be compensated for. You can't ever thank the teacher enough for what they've done for you. At least I found that to be true. My life has been immeasurably enriched by Zen practice and what our teacher has done for me in my life. My teacher, when I was first diagnosed with my illness, I was in Port Angeles, and my teacher grabbed a couple of students and came up to Port Angeles and moved me down here to Olympia so that I could be somewhere where I could get the treatment that I needed. That's what my teacher did for me, and that's just one example. each teacher gives their whole life force to this practice. And it's not like they were just somebody who answered an ad and went through an interview process. They were chosen by a transmitter of the Dharma to transmit the Dharma. So we owe them respect for and gratitude for the fact that they continue to transmit the Dharma in this way. And so we provide material support for their life. There's an exchange between the monastics and laity that goes on in traditional Buddhist practice, where there's a particular time of year where the Sangha gives cloth to the monks for their clothing. And this was like in the past. Nowadays, it's generally a little different than that. But when I was training at Shasta Abbey, there was a whole group of Vietnamese Buddhists that used to come up from Reading with a couple of big vans full of food. And they would also give to each monk a bag of, they had, let's see, what do we have? We had a towel in there. We had some toiletries and then a little cash gift. And we were all sitting around at the dining tables, and these people came in and passed in front of us and gave us these gifts, and we bowed. And it was just such a moving exchange. I had tears running down my face, and the other monks were kind of making fun of me for being so emotional about it. But I was just totally moved by this gift that these people were giving to us just because we were monastics practicing the Dharma. I really appreciated it. So we give material support for the teacher's life, and that may take the form of money, or we might provide them with food on a regular basis. We might bring them things from the garden. It doesn't have to be cash, but we support the teacher's physical life. And most Zen teachers that I know are not able to live on just donations. They usually have some kind of an outside job to support themselves as well, because it costs so much to live in these days. Now here, we support our teacher by providing a residence for them to live and paying for most of their expenses. So in that way, we support the teacher's life. We also, as students, provide support to our teacher in their life challenges, in their family upsets and illness, their own illness and deaths in the family, or the teacher's death. When the teacher's dying, the students gather around and support the teacher with zazen. And make a sacred space. So there are things that we do for the teacher to support them in their life challenges as well. And as students, we take responsibility for our own egotistical and emotional reactions to admonishment, because part of the teacher's job is to keep us on the path. And when we start to stray off to the side, sometimes the teacher has to say unpleasant things to us. Not that they say them in an unpleasant way, but they might be things that we're not ready to hear. So the teacher may point out to us where we're kind of going off of the path. And that may be, maybe we don't really want to take that in. So we have to take responsibility for our own reaction to these admonishments. When I was in training at Shasta, I don't know how many monks were there at the time. I think it was about 28. So I had 28 teachers, basically. There were a few people there that were younger than I was in training years, but most of them were older than I was. And whenever I met them, I had to bow. And each one of them could admonish me. So I got admonished a lot. And the last thing that I wanted to mention is that we should be doing our own psychological work outside the Zendo as well, to avoid projecting parental issues onto the teacher. This is a big one. As a teacher, I've been the focus of those kinds of projections. And it takes a lot of discernment to realize that that's what's going on. And so we have to, as students, recognize the fact that we have some issues that we are working on that carry over from our childhood, and that we need to do that outside the Zendo and not within the context. We shouldn't make the teacher the object of those feelings, but it happens. And that's what sometimes causes difficulty in our relationships with the teacher. So that's the reciprocal relationship between the student and the teacher. And I've just barely scratched the surface there. I know there are lots of other things that we could talk about and questions that you're going to have. So I'm trying to get through this. So the other thing I wanted to mention is transmission that occurs between the teacher and the student. So I have a little example here from the Denkoroku of the 44th ancestor. Toshi Gisei is his name in our lineage chant. He was about 6 generations before Dogen Zenji, the founder of Soto Zen in Japan. And so that makes him a Chinese ancestor. So this is the little story that each chapter of the Denkoroku has at the beginning. Gisei trained under Fuzan Enkan, who had him look into the story about the non-Buddhist who said to the Buddha, irrespective of whether there is a word for it, which is the inexpressible, or not, what is it? After 3 years had passed, Enkan asked one day, can you recall the story? So this was Gisei's koan. What is it? So Enkan is saying, well, a lot of time has passed. You've been practicing all this time. What do you know about this story? Try to present what you have seen in it. Gisei was about to reply when Enkan covered Gisei's mouth with his hand. Gisei opened up completely and was awakened to his true self. So what just happened there? Enkan just reached out and covered his mouth after he asked him a question. What was going on there? Enkan was saying, you can't say anything about it. And Gisei went, all right then. And he woke up. He understood. But just by that little gesture of putting his hand over Gisei's mouth, Enkan transmitted the Dharma. So part of the teacher's job is to know your spiritual condition, to know when you approach that point where just a little push will put you right over the edge and will help you wake up. And this is in the Denkoroku, is the story. Every time the teacher does something that just gives that little push to the other person, to the student in the story, and he goes, boom, and wakes up. So this proximity that we have with the teacher, this intimacy that we have with the teacher, leads to mind transmission. because Enkan just did this little gesture, just this little gesture. He didn't say anything, but there was mind-to-mind transmission going on. A teacher has presence that comes with awakening. And the more awake the teacher is, the more presence they have. And you will notice that when you're in the physical presence of that teacher, you can feel it with your body. So the more awake the teacher is, the more presence they have, and the more they transmit. So I have a quotation here from one of my favorite teachers who is greatly enlightened and has a lot of presence. And this teacher says, "My main orientation when teaching is to point to aspects of people's deep experience of being that they may not have noticed before. Sort of like making what is known unconsciously, known consciously. When you experience something that you have known unconsciously, suddenly become known in a conscious way, it often evokes a deep experience inside, a deep recognition in the whole body-mind. This transmission is the evoking into consciousness what has formerly been unconscious. Sometimes what is being evoked is understanding, and sometimes it is literally a state of consciousness or a state of being, as in the case of Enkan and Gisei. Ideally, it is both. In real transmission, nothing is given to the student. Rather, something is evoked from within the student that was always and already there, but in an unconscious way. So the teaching happens with words and with presence and can be received both as words and by presence. When both words and presence are being utilized in both the teacher and the student, transmission can happen. The student evokes the teaching and the presence of the teacher, and the teacher evokes the presence and the understanding of the student. Then there is a two-way transmission, and both teacher and student benefit. And in the end, it is reality appearing as both the teacher and the student. Even in this moment, it is reality speaking these words and reality that is hearing them. So this mind-to-mind transmission is the greatest gift of the teacher-student relationship. And it takes both people. It takes two Buddhas. In the Jukai ceremony, we bow to each other. At the end of the Jukai ceremony, Buddha bows to Buddha. It's a very wonderful moment. I'm always touched by that. And so we keep in mind within this relationship that this Buddha is relating to another Buddha, that this is always the case. So Keizan Jokin always ended his lectures with a little poem, and I'm going to end my lecture today with a little poem. We sit in the mud at the bottom of the pond, sunk in the lake of Sangha. Raise our lotus flags toward the light. Wait for true eternity to flow in our direction. So we have a tiny bit of time left for some questions or comments. Perhaps you have questions or comments? Susie?
I wonder, well, I think first I want to thank you for your very practical talk. I found it very helpful in that way. What practical thoughts or guidance can you share with us about finding a teacher given this reality that we're in here in Olympia Zen Center?
Okay. So Susie is asking what practical advice I can give, given the reality here at Olympia Zen Center about finding a teacher. The old saying is that when you are ready, the teacher will come to you, which I did find to be the case. And I think it's a question of working with whatever is in front of you at this time. So perhaps in the case of a Sangha in transition, there might not be a teacher for a while. Now, I'm gonna pick on Kaylee here because she's sat with a Sangha that didn't have a teacher, but the Sangha was a Sangha that had been together for 40 years.
About 40.
Yeah. So they had, sometimes they had a teacher and sometimes they didn't, but it was the Sangha that held itself together. So the Sangha itself served in the stead of the teacher, if that makes sense. And I think it's a kind of a situation that we sort of are facing in this case, that the Sangha comes together and creates a teaching environment for themselves. Am I putting that correctly?
Yeah, definitely everyone brought in what they could, and the senior members did a lot to make sure that we had someone on sound and someone doing a reading and someone leading and someone unlocking doors and locking doors.
So everyone contributed what they could to keep practice going. So that's the important thing, I think. And then I think it's hard for me to see into the future because of the kind of chaotic situation that we have in the world today. Whereas we might at one point in the past have been able to just reach out and find another teacher, it might not be so easy this time. And as for a personal experience of finding a teacher, in my experience, the teacher showed up in my world is what happened. So I think if you have that aspiration out there, that in some mysterious way draws the teacher into your world. So that's not a very practical suggestion, I'm sorry. But I think that's kind of the way the Dharma works. We say, the Dharma is mysterious. It is very mysterious. Lisa.
I have a question. In the Zen tradition in this school, may a teacher deny? Like if a student wants to seek a teacher, what's the protocol in this tradition, or like in Zen? Can a teacher say no?
If you want to go to another teacher, can
No. Like are as a teacher, are you like do you say yes to anyone who comes and want to be a student?
Yes.
of yours?
Yes. I think the only instance in which a teacher would deny a student would be if that person was some kind of a Sangha breaker who caused trouble within the Sangha and was looking to cause separation instead of harmony, and had been admonished numerous times and was unable to change their behavior in that way. Because you have to care for everyone in the Sangha, not just that one person. As the teacher, your concern is the whole health of the Sangha. So that's the only instance that I can think of where you would say, please leave. Yeah.
Jikyo,
Yes.
but might not the teacher say you're not ready? And come back when you've solved some things in your own life.
You could, to a person that,
To a person, yes.
to that kind of a person that,
No, not to that kind of a person, but
oh,
to anyone coming and say, can I be your student? And if you think the person hasn't practiced enough or they're just not ready, might you?
okay. So Mickey's asking if in the case a person was not ready, would you say you're not ready to come to practice? There have been instances where there are certain mental health categories in which I discourage meditation. One of those is when a person has suffered a lot of trauma in the past, and their trauma is untreated. They have not dealt with the trauma. Then in that particular instance, I would say you're better off not meditating at this point and working with someone who can help you deal with the effects of the trauma that you have suffered. Because meditation is not a cure-all, and you have to have a self in order to deconstruct a self. So it's really important for a teacher to be able to discern when that is the case for someone. Or there are also sometimes people who are very let's see what I want to call it, just really overactive. They have really overactive minds, and they can't sit still. So in those cases, I would recommend that they do walking meditation instead of sitting meditation. So we have many different things, many different tools that we can use to support the benefit of the person who comes to us. And yes, there are times when we have to say, I don't think this is the right place for you at this time. Yes.
This is sort of similar to Susan's question, but I'm curious both in the kind of traditional sense and also just in the practical sense of where we are, not only here, but in the world today. What is the guidance around teachers and like in different traditions? Within different, what is the guidance or what is around people having teachers in more than one tradition or participating in different traditions?
Yeah. Okay. So Susie's asking what the guidance is for the student-teacher relationship if you are participating in different traditions. Well, from my perspective, at some point you have to choose. You have to make a choice and a commitment to one kind of practice or another, because you can't really go deeply into practice unless you are in a particular form of practice. Because you have to get beyond the forms and the ceremonies and into the real meat of practice. And so it's, I think at some point you have to make a choice and pick one. But in the meantime, I think you would act towards any teacher in any tradition. You would treat them with the same care and respect that you treat your root teacher. So you would treat all teachers with great respect and gratitude for their transmission of the Dharma, regardless of tradition. Does that answer your question? Yeah, okay.
Jikyo,
Yes.
can I ask, do you still have a Sangha and a center in Port Angeles?
Well, before I left, we went through about a 6-month period where we read a book about how to do a Sangha without a teacher. And they're still sitting there. It's not my Sangha anymore. And they don't have a teacher, but they still sit together. And it's been 5 years since I left there. So Joyous Refuge is still joyous.
About that time.
Yes, we are. We are totally out of time. So thank you very much.
Buddham